Have you ever been judged by the clothes on your back in a room full of millionaires? What happens when a ruthless billionaire CEO spots a struggling single dad at the most exclusive restaurant in the city will leave you absolutely speechless. This isn't a predictable fairy tale. It's a gripping story of corporate betrayal, a father's unbroken promise, and a jaw-dropping twist nobody saw coming. Buckle up, because this restaurant confrontation shattered an empire and changed two lives forever. The glass doors of Per Se, overlooking the sprawling twilight of Columbus Circle in Manhattan, felt heavier than vault doors to Thomas Wright. Outside, a bitter November wind whipped through New York City, but inside the legendary 3-Michelin-star restaurant, the air was warm, thick with the scent of white truffles, aged Bordeaux, and unadulterated wealth. Thomas stood in the foyer, his hand gripping the small, trembling fingers of his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He wore a charcoal suit that was 5 years out of date, the lapels slightly frayed, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. It was the best thing he owned, the very suit he had worn to his wife Clara's funeral 2 years ago. But beside him, Lily wore a beautiful but modest navy blue dress, purchased second-hand, her hair tied in neat braids. She looked up at the towering wine displays and the crystal chandeliers with wide, awe-struck eyes. Thomas had saved for 14 months for this night. It was Clara's dying wish that he take Lily to Per Se for her 7th birthday, a place Clara had always dreamed of visiting before the cancer and the crushing medical debt took her away. Thomas had sold his car, taken double shifts at the drafting firm where he was treated like a glorified intern, and skipped countless meals just to afford the deposit for this reservation. The maitre d', a tall man with a razor-sharp jawline and a bespoke Italian suit, looked Thomas up and down. The calculation in the host's eyes was instantaneous and brutal. He noted the scuffed wingtip shoes, the outdated cut of the suit, and the cheap plastic digital watch on Thomas's wrist. "Name?" the maitre d' asked. His tone clipped, completely devoid of the deferential warmth he had just offered the hedge fund manager who walked in before them. "Right. Table for 2 at 7, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. The host stared at his tablet for an uncomfortably long time. Mr. Wright, I see. I must remind you that our dining room maintains a strict dress code. While you technically meet the requirement of a jacket, we generally expect a certain standard." Thomas felt a flush of humiliation crawl up his neck. "We are celebrating my daughter's birthday. We have a reservation. Are you turning us away?" The host sighed, a microscopic exhalation of disdain. "Follow me." They were led not to the prime tables by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, but to a small, cramped two-top near the swinging kitchen doors. Thomas didn't care. He pulled out the heavy chair for Lily, who clambered up, her eyes sparkling with absolute joy. Across the hushed dining room, at a sprawling corner booth draped in privacy, sat Madeleine Montgomery. At 38, Madeleine was the undisputed titan of Montgomery Holdings, a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm known on Wall Street as the Reaper, dressed in an immaculate Tom Ford silk suit, her dark hair pulled into a severe chignon. She possessed a beauty that was as cold and sharp as a diamond. She was currently enduring a tedious dinner with Richard Bancroft, a prominent real estate developer, and his socialite wife, Eleanor. Bancroft was attempting to secure a $300 million credit line from Madeleine's firm for a new Hudson Yards development. Madeleine was barely listening to his sycophantic pitch. Her sharp, predatory eyes were scanning the room, analyzing the power dynamics of the elite. That was when her gaze snagged on the man near the kitchen doors. She noticed Thomas not because he belonged, but because he so violently did not, in a sea of Patek Philippe watches and Chanel pearls. Thomas looked like a man drowning. Yet, there was a quiet, unyielding dignity about him as he unfolded his napkin and placed it on his daughter's lap. "Can you believe they let just anyone in here nowadays?" Eleanor Bancroft whispered loudly, her lip curling in disgust as she followed Madeleine's gaze. "This used to be a respectable establishment. Now it looks like a soup kitchen." Madeleine's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression unreadable. "He's dining with his child, Eleanor. Hardly a crime. It ruins the ambiance." Richard Bancroft chimed in, swirling his $3,000 Cabernet. People pay for exclusivity. Madeleine, we pay to be away from the struggle. I'm going to have a word with the manager. It's our anniversary, and I won't have it spoiled by some commoner." Before Madeleine could object, Richard signaled the floor manager with an arrogant snap of his fingers. Over at the kitchen table, Thomas was handing Lily a small, leather-bound sketchbook. It had been Clara's. He had brought it to keep Lily occupied during the 3-hour tasting menu. "Draw the room for Mommy, sweetie," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Show her where we are." The floor manager, alerted by Richard Bancroft, approached Thomas's table. He carried a silver tray with the check folder on it, though they hadn't even been served water yet. "Mr. Wright," the manager said, his voice a low, threatening purr. "It seems there has been a mistake with your reservation. We are overbooked tonight. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to vacate the table." Thomas froze. The color drained from his face. "Excuse me? We booked this over a year ago. I confirmed it this morning. Be that as it may, we have VIP guests who require a more refined atmosphere," the manager said, not even bothering to hide his condescension. "I will refund your deposit. Now, if you would quietly pack up your things, it would save us the trouble of calling security." Lily looked up from her sketchbook, her little lip trembling. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" Thomas's hands clenched into fists under the table. The injustice of it burned in his chest, a roaring fire born from 2 years of grief, poverty, and endless struggle. He was not going to let them take this night from Clara's memory. He was not going to let his daughter feel like she was garbage. "I am not leaving," Thomas said, his voice low but carrying a steel that made the manager blink. "I paid my deposit. We are dressed appropriately. We are sitting here quietly. You will bring us the menus, or you will have to physically drag me out of this restaurant in front of every single one of your wealthy patrons." The manager's face hardened. He reached for the radio earpiece tucked behind his collar. "Have it your way, sir. Security to the main dining floor, please." Across the room, Madeleine watched the confrontation escalate. She watched the way Thomas shielded his daughter with his own body, placing a protective hand over hers. And then, her eyes drifted to the leather sketchbook sitting open on the table. From her vantage point, her hawk-like vision caught the intricate, geometric lines drawn on the page. It wasn't a child's drawing. It was a highly sophisticated architectural blueprint. Something clicked in Madeleine's mind. A memory of a file she had reviewed 6 months ago. The disgraced architect, who took the fall for a massive structural failure in a downtown commercial tower. The scapegoat. Richard Bancroft leaned back in his leather chair, smirking in satisfaction, as 2 burly security guards in dark suits entered the dining room and marched toward Thomas's table. "Good," Richard chuckled. "Trash belongs outside." Madeleine slowly placed her crystal wine glass onto the white linen tablecloth. The quiet clink sounded like a gunshot to those who knew her well. "Richard," Madeleine said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. "Do you know what I despise more than bad investments?" Richard blinked, startled by the sudden shift in her demeanor. No. Madeleine." "What?" Parasites who build their fortunes on the backs of honest men, she said softly. Before Richard could process the insult, Madeleine stood up. The scraping of her chair against the hardwood floor silenced the immediate vicinity. When Madeleine Montgomery moved, the world stopped to watch. She walked across the dining room, her heels clicking rhythmically, commanding the attention of every billionaire, celebrity, and politician in the room. The two security guards had just reached Thomas and were reaching out to grab his arms. "Take your hands off him," Madeleine's voice rang out, cutting through the hushed murmurs of the restaurant like a scythe. The guards froze. The floor manager spun around, his face paling instantly as he recognized the most powerful woman in Manhattan standing mere inches away. "Ms. Montgomery, I apologize for the disturbance. We are just removing this." "If you finish that sentence," Madeleine interrupted, her tone lethal, "I will personally buy the holding company that owns this restaurant tomorrow morning, fire you, blacklist you from every hospitality group on the Eastern Seaboard, and turn this building into a parking garage. Do we understand each other?" The manager's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. Yes, Ms. Montgomery." "Dismissed," she commanded. The manager and the security guards practically tripped over themselves, scrambling back to the kitchen. Thomas sat frozen in his chair, his arms still wrapped protectively around Lily. He looked up at the stunning, terrifying woman standing over his table. "I thank you, but I don't need charity." "This isn't charity, Mr. Wright," Madeleine said, her voice softening slightly as she looked down at him. Thomas's eyes widened. "How do you know my name?" "I know a lot of things, Thomas," Madeleine said. She smoothly pulled up a chair from an adjacent, empty table and sat down uninvited. She glanced at the sketchbook. "I know that you designed the load-bearing framework for the Vanguard Tower. I know that the design was flawless, and I know that the developer substituted your high-grade steel for cheap, uncertified alloys to save $40 million, and then pinned the resulting structural fractures on your incompetence to avoid federal prison." Thomas felt all the air leave his lungs. He had fought for 2 years to prove his innocence, draining his life savings on lawyers, only to be crushed by the developer's massive legal team. It was the stress of that lawsuit that had prevented him from being at Clara's side during her final weeks. "Who are you?" Thomas breathed, pulling Lily closer. Madeleine didn't answer him directly. Instead, she turned her head and locked eyes with Richard Bancroft across the room. Richard had gone completely white, sweat practically shining on his forehead under the dim lights. "Tell me, Thomas," Madeleine said loudly, her voice echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings so that every ear in the room could hear. "Who was the lead developer on the Vanguard Tower project?" Thomas stared at her, then followed her gaze to the corner booth. His jaw tightened. "Bancroft Real Estate." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Eleanor Bancroft covered her mouth in horror as the social elite of New York turned their judging, vulture-like gazes upon her husband. Madeleine smiled, a shark showing its teeth. "Richard Bancroft asked me for a $300 million lifeline tonight because the SEC is quietly investigating his firm for fraud, and his creditors are circling. He needed my money to cover up the embezzlement." She stood up slowly, her eyes burning into Bancroft. "Richard, you have until the end of the week to publicly confess to the Vanguard fraud and clear Mr. Wright's name. If you do not, my legal team will hand over the financial ledgers we acquired during our due diligence directly to the federal prosecutor. Enjoy your anniversary." Richard Bancroft looked like he was about to vomit. He threw his napkin on the table, grabbed his weeping wife by the arm, and practically ran for the exit, leaving a trail of shattered reputation in his wake. The dining room remained dead silent, the heavy hitters of Wall Street absolutely stunned by the brutal, surgical destruction of a titan that had just occurred before their appetizers had even arrived. Madeleine turned back to Thomas. The coldness in her eyes vanished entirely when she looked at the little girl gripping the sketchbook. Lily was staring up at Madeleine with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a superhero?" Lily asked innocently. For the first time in perhaps a decade, a genuine, warm laugh escaped Madeleine Montgomery's lips. "No, little one. Just a woman who hates bullies." She looked at Thomas, who was staring at her with tears of disbelief welling in his eyes. "Why?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this for us?" Madeleine looked at the worn suit, the plastic watch, and the fierce love of a father who had risked everything just to keep a promise to his late wife. "Because, Thomas," she said softly, 5 years ago, Clara was the only nurse in the ICU who held my hand when I was recovering from a near-fatal car crash. She talked about you and Lily every single night. I promised her if she ever needed a favor, I would be there." Madeleine snapped her fingers at the trembling waiter hovering nearby. "Bring this man and his daughter the chef's tasting menu. Put it on my tab. Actually, bring them the best champagne you have. We are celebrating." The rest of the evening at Per Se was a surreal blur of culinary perfection and emotional catharsis. For the first time in 2 years, Thomas felt the crushing weight of the world lift from his shoulders. Waiters who had previously looked through him now treated him with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. Lily, completely oblivious to the high-stakes corporate execution that had just taken place, delighted in the oysters and pearls and the decadent chocolate cake adorned with a single, glowing candle. Madeleine Montgomery had discreetly paid the bill and vanished into the Manhattan night before Thomas could properly express the magnitude of his gratitude. But the reality of Madeleine's intervention hit the city like a seismic shockwave by sunrise. At 6:30 a.m., Thomas sat at the tiny Formica table in his cramped Queens apartment, staring at the screen of his battered laptop. The front page of the Wall Street Journal website blared a headline that made his heart pound against his ribs. "Bancroft Real Estate plunges 40% in pre-market trading amidst SEC probe rumors." Bloomberg television was playing on low volume in the background, where anchors frantically speculated about Richard Bancroft's sudden resignation from the board of 3 major charities overnight. The empire of the man who had destroyed Thomas's life was crumbling in real time, completely orchestrated by a woman sitting at a dinner table. His flip phone buzzed, vibrating violently against the wood. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" Thomas answered, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Mr. Wright, it's Madeleine Montgomery." Her voice was crisp, lacking the gentle warmth she had shown Lily the night before. She was entirely in CEO mode. "I assume you've seen the morning papers." "I have," Thomas said, glancing at Lily, who was still asleep on the pull-out sofa. "Ms. Montgomery, I don't know what to say. You didn't just buy us dinner. You gave me my life back. I settle my debts. Thomas, Clara saved my life when the doctors had written me off. Exposing Bancroft was merely collateral damage." Madeleine replied smoothly. "However, clearing your name is only step 1. A cleared name doesn't pay rent. I am sending a car to your apartment. It will be there in 1 hour. Bring your sketches, the real ones." Before Thomas could ask any questions, the line went dead. 60 minutes later, a sleek black Maybach idled on the gritty street outside Thomas's building. He had dropped Lily off at her elementary school, promising her a special ice cream trip later, before climbing into the luxurious vehicle. He was whisked to the financial district, arriving at the towering glass monolith of Montgomery Holdings. Madeleine's office on the 68th floor was a testament to cold, modern power, floor-to-ceiling glass, stark white marble, and minimalist furniture. She stood by the window, looking out over the harbor, a steaming cup of black coffee in her hand. "Sit, Thomas," she commanded without turning around. She finally faced him, her piercing blue eyes assessing him. "Bancroft's lawyers contacted mine at 4 a.m. He is taking the plea deal. By tomorrow, a formal public apology will be issued, taking full responsibility for the Vanguard Tower structural failures and completely exonerating you. The State Architecture Board will reinstate your license by Friday." Thomas buried his face in his hands, letting out a shaky breath. Tears pricked his eyes, but he forced them back. "I can finally work again. I can give Lily the life Clara wanted for her." That brings me to why you are here," Madeleine said, walking to her massive mahogany desk. She slid a thick, leather-bound dossier across the polished surface. "Montgomery Holdings just acquired a 50-acre plot of land on the waterfront in Brooklyn. We are building a tech campus, a billion-dollar development meant to rival anything in Silicon Valley. It needs a visionary. It needs someone who understands structural integrity better than anyone in this city." Thomas stared at the dossier. "You want me to design it? Ms. Montgomery, I haven't practiced in 2 years. I'm a pariah." "You were a pariah," she corrected sharply. "Tomorrow, you will be the martyr who survived the corrupt machine of New York real estate. The press will love you. But more importantly, I saw your blueprints last night. You are a genius, Thomas. You just trusted the wrong people." Madeleine leaned forward, her expression darkening. "Speaking of trusting the wrong people, did you really think Bancroft acted alone to frame you?" Thomas frowned, confusion knotting his brow. "He was the developer. He controlled the material orders. He controlled the money," Madeleine corrected. "But to alter those blueprints and make it look like the structural flaw was your original design. He needed someone on the inside of your firm. He needed another architect to forge the digital timestamps." The room grew freezing cold. Thomas's stomach dropped as the implication settled in. "No, that's impossible. Gregory Pierce was my mentor. Pierce and Associates was like a family to me. Gregory fought for me during the trial." Madeleine pulled a single sheet of paper from a file and pushed it toward him. It was a bank statement, an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, showing a wire transfer of $2 million. The date of the transfer was exactly 3 days before the Vanguard Tower scaffolding collapsed. The recipient was Gregory Pierce. "Your mentor sold you out for $2 million, Thomas," Madeleine said quietly. "Bancroft was the muscle, but Pierce was the knife in your back." The revelation hit Thomas with the force of a physical blow. Gregory Pierce had been at Clara's funeral. He had stood in the rain, placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, and told him that they would weather the storm of the Vanguard scandal together. To discover that the man who had taught him everything about drafting, who had practically been a grandfather to Lily, was the architect of his destruction, was almost too much to bear. "Why?" Thomas whispered, staring at the damning offshore statement. His firm was incredibly successful. $2 million is a lot of money, but it's not worth ruining someone's life over. It is when you have a crippling gambling addiction that the public doesn't know about, Madeleine stated, taking a sip of her coffee. "My private investigators dug into Pierce after I realized the paperwork in the Vanguard case looked too clean. Pierce owed money to some very unpleasant people in Atlantic City. Bancroft offered to wipe Pierce's slate clean in exchange for a scapegoat. You were the rising star of the firm, Thomas. You were handling the biggest project. You were the easiest target. Anger, pure and unadulterated, began to replace the shock in Thomas's veins. He had spent 2 years scrubbing toilets at night and drafting meaningless CAD models during the day, watching his wife die while buried under the stress of a lawsuit, all because of Gregory Pierce's cowardice. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice hardening, losing the tentative edge it had carried since the restaurant. Madeleine smiled. It was the same predatory smile she had given Richard Bancroft. "We don't just expose him, Thomas. Exposing him sends him to prison, where he gets 3 meals a day and writes a memoir. No. We take his legacy. We take everything he has built." She tapped the dossier for the Brooklyn waterfront tech campus. Pierce & Associates is currently the frontrunner to win the bid for the city's new transit hub, a massive municipal contract worth hundreds of millions. It's the crown jewel of Gregory's career. You are going to design my tech campus, but first, you are going to help me destroy Pierce's bid for that transit hub. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas's life transformed at whiplash speed. He was given a corner office at Montgomery Holdings, a generous 6-figure advance, and an unlimited budget. He bought Lily new clothes, moved them into a beautiful, secure apartment in the Upper West Side, and hired a highly recommended nanny for when he had to work late. But the work was not just drafting, it was war. Madeleine and Thomas worked late into the nights, analyzing Pierce's proposed transit hub designs. Because Thomas had worked under Gregory for 10 years, he knew every shortcut his former mentor took, every structural bias he favored, and every aesthetic crutch he relied upon. One evening, while poring over structural load estimates, the heavy oak door to Thomas's office pushed open. Lily walked in, clutching a stuffed rabbit, followed closely by Madeleine, who looked completely out of her element holding a child's juice box. "She insisted on bringing you dinner," Madeleine said, a rare, genuine flush of color on her cheeks. Thomas smiled, clearing a space on his massive drafting table. "Thanks. Pumpkin." Lily climbed onto a stool and looked at Madeleine. "Do you like drawing too?" Madeleine paused. The ruthless CEO, feared by Wall Street brokers and real estate tycoons alike, looked down at the 7-year-old girl. "I'm not very good at drawing. Lily, I'm better at organizing things, putting the pieces together." "My mommy was good at putting pieces together," Lily said innocently. "She used to fix broken things at the hospital." The silence in the room stretched, heavy and poignant. Madeleine's eyes softened, a flash of vulnerability breaking through her titanium exterior. "She fixed me. Lily. She was very brave." Thomas watched the interaction, realizing for the first time that Madeleine's ruthless crusade for justice wasn't just about power or settling a debt. It was about preserving the memory of the one person who had treated Madeleine as a human being when she was completely broken and vulnerable in a hospital bed. The tender moment was shattered by the shrill ringing of Madeleine's private cell phone. She stepped out into the hallway to answer it. When she returned a minute later, her face was a mask of cold fury. "What is it?" Thomas asked, standing up. "Bancroft," Madeleine hissed. "He just breached the plea agreement. He didn't issue the public apology." "Why?" Thomas felt panic rising. "You have the evidence of his embezzlement. You were going to send it to the SEC." "I did," Madeleine said, her voice tight. But Bancroft didn't just sit on his hands for the last 3 weeks. He went to Gregory Pierce. They realized that if they go down together. So, they pooled their resources and hired the most aggressive crisis management firm in Washington, and they just fired the first shot. She pulled out her tablet and swiped to a breaking news alert from the New York Times. The headline read, "Billionaire Madeleine Montgomery, under federal investigation for corporate espionage and blackmail." Whistleblower claims she fabricated Vanguard Tower evidence. They bought a federal prosecutor, Madeleine said quietly, her eyes burning with an intense, dangerous light. They are claiming that I manufactured the evidence against them to steal the Brooklyn waterfront land from Bancroft at a discounted rate, and that I'm using a disgraced, unstable architect, you, as a pawn. Thomas stared at the headline. The nightmare wasn't over. It was escalating. The empire was striking back, and this time, they were trying to take down the only person who had ever stood up for him. The morning after the New York Times article dropped, the 68th floor of Montgomery Holdings was a war zone. Telephones rang incessantly, their shrill tones overlapping into a deafening chorus of corporate panic. News helicopters circled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, their rotors vibrating the heavy glass. The stock of Montgomery Holdings had taken a 6% hit in early trading, a drop that represented billions of dollars in lost market capitalization. In the executive boardroom, Madeleine Montgomery stood at the head of a massive granite table, flanked by her crisis management team and a very nervous board of directors. Thomas sat in the corner, feeling entirely out of his depth as men and women in bespoke suits shouted over one another. "Madeleine, this is a disaster." William Bradley, the senior board member, yelled over the clamor. His face flushed. "Preston Carmichael is the most aggressive federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. If he is formally opening an investigation into corporate espionage, our institutional investors will pull their capital by Friday. You need to step down as CEO pending the investigation." "If I step down, it implies guilt." "William," Madeleine fired back, her voice deadly calm, slicing through the panic. "Carmichael is in Bancroft's pocket. The allegations are entirely fabricated. The market doesn't care about the truth. It cares about optics," Bradley countered, slamming his fist on the table. "You've tied this firm to a disgraced architect and initiated a blood feud with Richard Bancroft over a 50-acre plot of dirt in Brooklyn. It's reckless. It's not about the Brooklyn land. And it never was," Madeleine said coldly. "And Mr. Wright is not a disgraced architect. He is the victim of a coordinated fraud, which I intend to prove." "With what? The evidence they are now claiming you manufactured?" Bradley scoffed. "You need to cut ties with Thomas Wright immediately. Throw him to the wolves, issue a statement that you were misled by him, and settle with Bancroft out of court. It is the only way to save the firm." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Bradley was right. From a purely mathematical, corporate standpoint, Thomas was a liability. He stood up from his chair, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice resolute. "Ms. Montgomery," Thomas said, drawing the eyes of the entire boardroom. "He is right. You have already done more than enough for Lily and me. You bought us time. You gave me hope. I won't let you lose your empire because of my battles. I will resign. I'll sign a statement saying I brought you the evidence independently." The room fell silent. Bradley looked relieved. Madeleine turned to Thomas. The ice in her blue eyes melted for a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound respect. Then, she turned back to the board. "If any of you ever suggest I abandon an innocent man to save a stock price again, I will personally see to it that you never sit on another corporate board in this country," Madeleine said, her tone dripping with venom. "I do not negotiate with terrorists, and I do not settle with frauds." Meeting adjourned, she marched out of the boardroom, her heels echoing like rifle shots. Thomas hurried after her, catching up as she swept into a private office and slammed the door shut. "Madeleine," "You can't do this," Thomas pleaded. "They will destroy you. Carmichael is ruthless." Madeleine poured herself a glass of sparkling water, her hands perfectly steady. "Carmichael is a symptom. Pierce and Bancroft are the disease. They think because they bought a badge, they've checkmated me. They haven't." She walked over to her desk and activated a secure, encrypted monitor. I had my lead investigator, Donovan Hayes, dig into Preston Carmichael's financials overnight. Carmichael has a squeaky clean record. No offshore accounts. No sudden influxes of cash. He's practically a ghost. "Then why would he help them?" Thomas asked, frustrated. "Because currency in Washington isn't always cash," Madeleine replied. "It's influence. Carmichael is planning a run for the Senate next year. He needs backing. Bancroft has a super PAC that can legally funnel millions into a campaign. But to prove that quid pro quo, we need hard evidence. The Cayman Islands wire transfer isn't enough anymore because they are claiming I forged the digital receipt." Thomas rubbed his temples, his mind racing back to the years he spent toiling at Pierce and Associates. He tried to think of Gregory Pierce, not as the monster who betrayed him, but as the man he worked beside for a decade. Pierce was meticulous. He was old school. He didn't trust the cloud. He didn't trust digital servers. Suddenly, a memory hit Thomas with the force of a freight train. "The Pritzker." Thomas breathed, his eyes widening. Madeleine paused. "Excuse me?" "Gregory Pierce won a minor architectural award a decade ago, a precursor to the Pritzker Prize," Thomas said, his words spilling out rapidly. He had it framed in his private office, a massive, heavy bronze plaque, but he never let the cleaning staff dust it. He always did it himself. Once, when we were working late on a deadline, I walked into his office to drop off some blueprints. He didn't hear me come in. The plaque was swung open on a hidden hinge. Madeleine's eyes sharpened into daggers of focus. "A wall safe!" Thomas nodded eagerly. Yes, it wasn't digital. It was an old-school, biometric and dial combination safe. Gregory didn't trust digital receipts for his gambling debts. If Bancroft paid him off and if they are colluding with Carmichael now, Gregory would keep a physical ledger, a tangible insurance policy against Bancroft in case their alliance ever soured. Madeleine stared at him, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. A physical ledger, proving the original Vanguard payoff and potentially outlining the bribes for the Senate run. "If we can get it, we can bypass the forgery accusations entirely," Thomas said. "Physical, handwritten evidence, logged with his personal seal. But it's inside the secure headquarters of Pierce and Associates in Midtown. The building requires keycard access, biometric scanning for the executive floor, and armed security." Madeleine picked up her phone and dialed a private number. "Donovan, we have a target. I need a blueprint of the Midtown Pierce and Associates building, and I need the security rotation schedule." She hung up and looked at Thomas. "We have 72 hours before Carmichael formally files the federal indictment and seizes my assets. We are going to rob Gregory Pierce. Infiltrating one of the most secure architectural firms in Manhattan required a diversion of massive proportions. Fortunately, for Madeleine and Thomas, Gregory Pierce's ego provided the perfect opportunity. The following evening, Pierce was hosting the Foundations of Tomorrow charity gala at the Waldorf Astoria, an extravagant black tie event designed to publicly cement his status as the frontrunner for the city's new transit hub. The plan was audacious. Madeleine would attend the gala, commanding the attention of the press, the elite, and most importantly, Gregory Pierce and Richard Bancroft, while she kept the wolves distracted in the ballroom. Thomas and Donovan Hayes, Madeleine's shadow operative, would breach the Midtown office. At 9:01 p.m., A sleek black van parked in a loading alley 2 blocks away from the Pearson Associates headquarters. Inside, Thomas was dressed entirely in black, a stark contrast to the worn suit he had worn at Per Se just weeks ago. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Donovan, a broad-shouldered man with a military buzz cut and eyes devoid of humor, handed Thomas a cloned RFID keycard and a small earpiece. "Com check," Donovan said, his voice crackling in Thomas's ear. "I hear you," Thomas whispered back. "Ms. Montgomery has just entered the Waldorf," Donovan reported, looking at a bank of monitors in the van. "She's making a scene. Pierce has his eyes locked on her. You have a 45-minute window before the roving security patrol checks the executive floor. Let's move." Thomas slipped out of the van and navigated the shadows of the midtown alleyways. He reached the rear service entrance of the building. His hands were sweating, but he forced himself to focus. He swiped the cloned card against the reader. The light blinked green, and the heavy steel door clicked open simultaneously. Under the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom, Madeleine Montgomery was executing her part of the operation. She wore a stunning, blood-red Oscar de la Renta gown that seemed to absorb the light around her. The moment she stepped into the room, the string quartet might as well have stopped playing. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Wasn't she under federal investigation? How dared she show her face here? Gregory Pierce, holding a flute of champagne and speaking with a group of city councilmen, stiffened as he saw her. Richard Bancroft, standing nearby, went rigid with barely concealed rage. Madeleine didn't shrink away. She walked straight into the lion's den, gliding across the marble floor until she stood face to face with the 2 men trying to destroy her. "Gregory, Richard," Madeleine said, her voice smooth like aged whiskey. "Lovely party, though I find the theme Foundations of Tomorrow a bit ironic, considering both of your foundations are built on rot." Pierce's smile was painfully tight. "Madeleine, you are very brave to come here, considering the federal indictment hovering over your head. I would have thought you'd be busy shredding documents." "I have nothing to hide, Gregory," she replied, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "But then again, I don't have a gambling problem that requires me to sell out my own protégés." Bancroft leaned in, his voice a guttural hiss. "You're finished, Madeleine. You played a stupid game with a loser architect, and now you're both going to prison." Madeleine took a slow sip of her drink, maintaining absolute eye contact, holding them firmly in her orbit while Thomas operated miles away. Back in the dark, silent corridors of the Midtown office building, Thomas bypassed the ground-floor security desk. He knew the blind spots of the cameras. He had designed the internal lobby layout himself 6 years ago. He slipped into the stairwell and began the grueling climb to the 14th floor. "Security patrol is on floor 10, moving down," Donovan's voice murmured in his ear. "You are clear to the executive suite." Thomas reached the 14th floor, his breath coming in short gasps. He approached the heavy glass doors of the executive suite. This was the first major hurdle, a biometric hand scanner. "Donovan, I'm at the scanner," Thomas whispered. "Copy. Engaging the server loop now," Donovan said. A moment later, the red light on the scanner flickered to blue. "I've rolled back the security registry to a backup from 3 years ago. Your biometrics should still be valid. Go." Thomas placed his hand on the glass panel. A laser swept over his palm. Beep! The heavy doors slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. He was in. He moved swiftly down the carpeted hallway, past his old cubicle, feeling a phantom ache in his chest. He pushed the feeling aside and entered Gregory Pierce's sprawling corner office. Moonlight spilled across the mahogany desk, illuminating the heavy bronze plaque mounted on the far wall. He approached the plaque. His hands traced the edges until he felt a tiny, concealed indentation at the base. He pressed it, and with a soft click, the heavy bronze award swung outward on a silent hinge, revealing the matte black face of a wall safe. "I have the safe," Thomas whispered. "It's a Sargent and Greenleaf rotary dial, coupled with a fingerprint reader." "Can you bypass it?" Donovan asked. "I don't need to," Thomas said, his mind flashing back to the countless hours he had spent observing his mentor. Gregory is arrogant, but he's also a creature of habit. He used his anniversary for his computer passwords, his alarm codes, everything. Let's hope he's just as unoriginal with his safe. Thomas dialed the numbers. 091482. He grabbed a piece of clear Scotch tape from Pierce's desk, remembering a trick from a documentary. He didn't have Pierce's fingerprint, but he didn't need it. He used a graphite pencil from the desk, shaved a tiny amount of dust onto the scanner to highlight the residual oils from Pierce's last use, and carefully pressed the tape over the glowing green pad to trick the thermal sensor. The safe beeped twice. The heavy locking bolts retracted. Thomas pulled the door open. Inside, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a thick, black leather ledger, alongside a stack of encrypted hard drives and bundles of $100 bills. Thomas grabbed the ledger, flipping it open with a small flashlight clenched in his teeth. There it was. Handwritten entries. Dates matching the Vanguard collapse. Exact dollar amounts matching the offshore transfer. And beneath that, a newer section labeled Campaign Contributions, P.C., with figures totaling over $4 million. "I have it," Thomas breathed. "I have everything. Get out of there! Now!" Donovan commanded, his voice suddenly sharp. The server rollback just triggered a silent alarm. The building has gone into lockdown. Security is coming up the elevators. You have less than 90 seconds. The red emergency strobe lights in Gregory Pierce's executive suite began to flash, casting sharp, violent shadows across the mahogany furniture. The shrill, piercing wail of the building's lockdown alarm echoed through the empty corridors. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, desperately throwing itself against a cage. He shoved the heavy, black leather ledger into his tactical backpack and zipped it shut, his hands shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and pure terror. "Thomas, they are on the 14th floor," Donovan's voice barked in the earpiece, entirely stripped of its usual deadpan calm. 3 armed guards. They are breaching the suite doors in 10 seconds. The stairwells are locked down magnetically from the security desk. You are trapped. I'm not, Thomas breathed, his mind racing through the 3-dimensional schematic of the building he had lived and breathed for a decade. He didn't run for the door. Instead, he sprinted toward the rear of Pierce's office, toward the private ensuite bathroom. "What are you doing? There's no exit there!" Donovan yelled. 6 years ago, the city updated the fire codes for high-rise executive suites, Thomas said, rapidly, his eyes scanning the marble-tiled wall of the bathroom. Gregory refused to ruin the aesthetic of the hallway with an external ventilation duct. So, I drafted a concealed HVAC chase directly behind his shower wall to route the air down to the 12th floor utility hub. Thomas grabbed a heavy brass soap dispenser from the vanity and smashed it against the large decorative mirror above the sink. The glass shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, cascading into the basin. Behind the mirror was exactly what he knew would be there. An industrial aluminum grate, fastened with 4 Phillips head screws. "They are in the office," Donovan warned. "They are sweeping the room." Thomas didn't have a screwdriver. He pulled a silver coin from his pocket, a 1921 Morgan dollar that had belonged to his grandfather, and jammed the edge into the first screw. He twisted violently. The metal scraped, but the screw turned. 1, 2, 3, 4. He heard heavy boots crossing the carpeted floor of the main office. "Check the bathroom," a gruff voice shouted. Thomas yanked the grate off, ignoring the sharp edge of the aluminum slicing into his palm, and threw himself headfirst into the narrow, pitch-black vertical shaft, just as the bathroom door was kicked open. He braced his boots and shoulders against the cold sheet metal of the duct, wedging himself in the darkness. Above him, a flashlight beam swept across the shattered mirror. "Nobody here. Mirror is busted. He must have gone back into the hall," a guard reported, his voice echoing eerily down the shaft. Thomas held his breath until his lungs burned, waiting for the footsteps to retreat. When silence finally returned, save for the blaring alarm, he began the agonizing, inch-by-inch descent down the duct. Dust coated his lungs, and the jagged seams of the metal tore through his black shirt, scraping his skin. But the heavy weight of the ledger in his backpack pushed him forward. It was his life, his reputation, and Lily's future, all wrapped in leather and ink. 10 minutes later, covered in sweat and grease, Thomas kicked out a lower grate and tumbled onto the concrete floor of the 12th floor utility room. "I'm out," Thomas gasped into the comms. "Heading for the secondary service elevator. It runs on a separate analog circuit for the maintenance crew." "I see it," Donovan replied, relief bleeding into his voice. "Van is positioned at the loading dock. Move." Miles away, at the Waldorf Astoria, Madeleine Montgomery was holding court. She stood near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room, radiating an untouchable aura of power. Richard Bancroft and Gregory Pierce were watching her like cornered animals, waiting for her to break under the pressure of the impending federal indictment. Her clutch vibrated. A single text message lit up the screen. "The eagle has left the nest. Package secured." A slow, chilling smile spread across Madeleine's lips. She looked up and locked eyes with Preston Carmichael, the ambitious federal prosecutor who had just walked into the ballroom, flanked by political aides. Carmichael looked smug, already practicing his victory speech for the morning's press conference, where he planned to publicly ruin her. Madeleine smoothly excused herself from a conversation with a tech billionaire and glided across the room, until she stood directly in Carmichael's path. "Prosecutor Carmichael," Madeleine said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. "Celebrating early," Carmichael offered a practiced, diplomatic smile, though his eyes were cold. "Ms. Montgomery, I am merely enjoying a charitable evening, though I imagine you should be with your legal counsel right now. Tomorrow will be a difficult day for you." "I find that the truth is rarely difficult." "Preston," Madeleine replied, taking a step closer, invading his personal space. She lowered her voice to a whisper, meant only for him. "Tell me, how is the Senate campaign shaping up? I hear media buys in upstate New York are terribly expensive this time of year." Carmichael's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "Of course you don't," Madeleine purred. "Just like you have no idea what combinations of numbers unlock a Sargent and Greenleaf rotary dial in a certain midtown office. Enjoy the champagne, Preston, because tomorrow you aren't going to be holding a press conference. You are going to be needing a defense attorney." She didn't wait for his response. Madeleine turned on her heel and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the federal prosecutor standing perfectly still, a cold sweat suddenly breaking out on his neck. The trap was set. The hammer was about to fall. The next morning, the sky over Manhattan was a bruised, heavy, gray, threatening rain. Outside the massive granite pillars of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse, a sea of reporters, news vans, and flashing cameras swarmed the steps. The impending indictment of billionaire Madeleine Montgomery, accused of fabricating evidence alongside a disgraced architect, was the biggest financial and political scandal of the decade. At exactly 9:20 a.m., Preston Carmichael stepped up to the podium. He adjusted his silk tie, projecting the image of a fearless crusader for justice. Behind him stood Richard Bancroft and Gregory Pierce, playing the roles of aggrieved victims to perfection. "Good morning," Carmichael began, his deep voice echoing through the microphone. "Today, my office is filing formal charges against Madeleine Montgomery and Thomas Wright for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and the willful fabrication of federal evidence. No one, regardless of their wealth or influence, is above the law. These individuals attempted to destroy the reputations of two pillars of the New York business community for their own financial gain." Cameras clicked furiously. Bancroft offered a solemn, mournful nod to the crowd. "We have irrefutable proof that the digital offshore bank records presented by Ms. Montgomery were doctored," Carmichael continued. "Therefore, You are perjuring yourself on live television. Preston!" A voice rang out, slicing through the murmur of the press like a diamond cutter. The reporters parted like the Red Sea. Striding up the courthouse steps was Madeleine Montgomery. She was flanked by three formidable men in dark suits, but it was the man walking directly beside her who caused the camera flashes to double in intensity. Thomas Wright walked with his head held high, his jaw set in stone. He carried a heavy, black leather ledger in his hands. Carmichael's face drained of all color. Bancroft took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over the microphone cord. Gregory Pierce stared at the black book in Thomas's hands, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. "Security!" Carmichael barked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Remove them from the premises!" "The security detail works for the federal government. Preston, not your political action committee," Madeleine declared, stopping 10 feet from the podium. She gestured to the three men beside her. "Allow me to introduce Special Agent Reynolds of the FBI Anti-Corruption Task Force. We spent the entire night going over a very interesting piece of bedtime reading." Madeleine turned to Thomas. The entire plaza fell dead silent, the only sound the hum of the television broadcasting equipment. Thomas looked up at Gregory Pierce, the man who had been a father figure, a mentor, and ultimately, his executioner. "You told me once, Gregory, that architecture is about leaving a permanent mark on the world. You said that concrete and steel don't lie, but you did." Thomas held up the ledger. "This is a physical, handwritten record of every bribe, every payoff, and every illegal campaign contribution made by Richard Bancroft to Gregory Pierce, and subsequently to prosecutor Preston Carmichael. It was kept in a biometric safe inside Pierce's office, secured with his personal seal. No digital timestamps to forge, no cloud servers to hack, just ink on paper, detailing exactly how much my life, and the safety of the Vanguard Tower, was worth to you." Chaos erupted. Reporters shouted questions simultaneously, lunging forward with their microphones. "Is this true, Mr. Carmichael?" a journalist from CNN screamed. "Did you take bribes to frame Thomas Wright?" another yelled. Carmichael backed away from the podium, his hands raised defensively. "This is a stunt! It's a complete fabrication! That book is stolen property!" "Ah," Madeleine noted smoothly, leaning into the nearest microphone. "So, you admit the book exists and belongs to Mr. Pierce. Thank you for confirming its authenticity for the federal record." Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward, pulling a stack of warrants from his jacket. "Preston Carmichael, Richard Bancroft, and Gregory Pierce, you are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, and bribery of a public official. Place your hands behind your backs." The implosion was instantaneous. As the federal agents moved in with handcuffs, the alliances shattered. "It was Bancroft!" Gregory Pierce screamed, his distinguished facade completely crumbling as an agent pushed him against the granite wall. "He forced me. He threatened to kill me over my gambling debts. He orchestrated the whole thing." "Shut your mouth, you pathetic old fool," Bancroft roared, struggling against his own cuffs. "You took the money willingly. You designed the flaw." Preston Carmichael simply stood in stunned silence as the cold steel clicked around his wrists, watching his Senate dreams evaporate into the gray morning air. The cameras captured every second of the spectacular downfall, broadcasting the destruction of three corrupt titans to millions of screens around the world. Madeleine turned away from the arrests and looked at Thomas. The exhaustion of the past 3 weeks was evident on his face, but his eyes were bright, shining with a profound, overwhelming relief. A reporter shoved a microphone in Thomas's face. "Mr. Wright, how does it feel to finally have your name cleared? Are you going to sue the city? What is your next move?" Thomas looked at the camera, thinking not of the millions he was owed in restitution, or the glittering tech campus he was about to design. He thought of the cramped apartment, the worn-out suit, and a little girl drawing in a sketchbook at a table near the kitchen doors of Per Se. "My name is cleared," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady and resolute. "That's all I ever wanted. I'm going to go home now. I promised my daughter I would take her for ice cream." The autumn wind whipped off the East River, carrying the scent of salt, ozone, and freshly welded steel. Thomas Wright stood on the concrete slab of what would soon be the 50-story centerpiece of the Montgomery Holdings Tech Campus in Brooklyn. He wore a hard hat, a high-visibility vest over a crisp dress shirt, and a pair of sturdy work boots. He held a rolled-up set of blueprints, watching a massive crane hoist a steel I-beam into the gray morning sky. It had been exactly 1 year since the night at Per Se. The legal fallout from the courthouse steps had been swift and merciless. Faced with the handwritten ledger and a mountain of corroborating financial anomalies, Richard Bancroft and Gregory Pierce had turned on each other like starved wolves. They both took plea deals to avoid a lengthy, humiliating public trial, resulting in federal prison sentences that would ensure they never saw the inside of a boardroom again. Preston Carmichael's political career ended before it even began. He was currently awaiting trial for public corruption, his reputation entirely radioactive. Thomas's architecture license had been formally reinstated, alongside a very public apology from the state board. Furthermore, the massive civil settlements he received from Bancroft Real Estate and the fractured remnants of Pierce and Associates meant that he and Lily would never have to worry about money for the rest of their lives. Yet, Thomas had not retired to a quiet life of luxury. He had thrown himself entirely into Madeleine Montgomery's vision. "It looks like a fortress," a smooth, commanding voice said from behind him. Thomas turned to see Madeleine navigating the uneven concrete with practiced grace. Despite wearing a tailored charcoal suit and stilettos, she carried 2 thermal cups of coffee, handing one to him as she approached the edge of the floor. "It's not a fortress," Thomas corrected with a faint, proud smile, unrolling the blueprint across a makeshift plywood table. "It's a beacon. The entire eastern facade is going to be reinforced. Electrochromic glass. It will adapt to the sunlight, completely transparent during the day, glowing from within at night. After what happened with the Vanguard Tower, I wanted to design something that had absolutely nothing to hide. You can see the load-bearing supports from the street. The strength is entirely on display. Madeleine looked out over the sprawling construction site, where hundreds of workers were bringing Thomas's genius to life. It's spectacular, Thomas. The board is thrilled. Even William Bradley formally admitted that hiring you was the most profitable decision this firm has made in a decade. I couldn't have drafted a single line of it without you, Madeleine, Thomas said softly, the gratitude in his voice as profound as it had been a year ago. We made a remarkably good team, she replied, her piercing blue eyes reflecting the steel beams above. Though I think my absolute favorite part of the project is the one we aren't telling the press about yet. Right on cue. A loud, cheerful voice echoed from the construction elevator. "Daddy!" Thomas turned as Lily, now 8 years old, bounded across the safe zone of the site. She was wearing a miniature pink hard hat and safety goggles that were slightly too big for her face. She was trailed closely by her nanny, but she ran straight past Thomas and threw her arms fearlessly around Madeleine's waist. The billionaire CEO, known as the Reaper of Wall Street, didn't flinch. Instead, she gently placed her hand on Lily's shoulder, a warm, genuine smile breaking across her face. "Hello, little architect. Did you bring the final sketches?" "I did," Lily beamed, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. She smoothed it out on the plywood next to Thomas's massive, intricate blueprints. It was a crayon drawing of a lush courtyard, filled with trees, winding paths, and a large, abstract water fountain. "It's perfect," Madeleine said seriously, treating the drawing with the utmost respect. "I will have the landscaping team execute it exactly as drawn." Thomas watched them, a familiar lump forming in his throat. Over the past 12 months, Madeleine had become an unexpected, permanent fixture in their lives. She never tried to replace Clara. No one ever could. But she had become a fierce, protective aunt to Lily, and the closest friend Thomas had ever known. Beneath the titanium exterior of the ruthless businesswoman was a loyal protector who had simply needed a reason to care again. Later that evening, the three of them stood on the unfinished top floor of the central tower. The sun was setting over Manhattan across the river, painting the skyline in brilliant shades of gold, amber, and violet. The city that had once chewed Thomas up and spit him out now sparkled like a handful of scattered diamonds. Entirely within his reach, Madeleine stepped forward, holding a sleek, silver remote control. "The city gave us permission to test the external lighting system tonight," she said. "I thought it only fitting that you do the honors. Thomas." She handed him the remote. Thomas looked at the small button, feeling the immense weight of the moment. He knelt down, wrapping one arm around his daughter. "Why don't we do it together, sweetie?" Lily placed her small hand over his. "Together." They pressed the button. A gentle hum vibrated through the floorboards as the massive grid of electrochromic glass powered on. Thousands of LED nodes built into the structural steel illuminated simultaneously. They didn't just glow randomly. The lights crawled up the exposed beams, converging at the crown of the building, forming a brilliant, warm amber halo that could be seen from miles away. It was breathtaking. It was a monument to resilience. "We need a name for the central tower," Madeleine said quietly, watching the reflection of the amber light dancing in the East River. "The board suggested the Montgomery Pavilion, but I vetoed it." Thomas looked at her, his heart swelling. "What did you name it?" Madeleine turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "The Clara Tower," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "Because without her, none of us would be standing here today. Thomas pulled Lily close, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He looked across the water at the glittering expanse of the city, realizing that true architecture wasn't just about building structures of glass and steel. It was about laying a foundation of truth, weathering the most violent storms, and trusting that the people who care about you will help you rebuild, higher and stronger than ever before. What a breathtaking conclusion! Thomas went from a desperate father on the brink of losing everything to the lead architect of a skyline-defining masterpiece, all because a ruthless billionaire remembered the kindness of a nurse. It is a powerful reminder that the good you put into the world always comes back to you, often when you need it the most, and from the most unexpected places. If this incredible story of justice, loyalty, and redemption moved you, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping true-to-life stories. See you next time.